How you doing there? Welcome back. Oof. Sheesh. All right. I think I'll be all right, though. Shit, I guess I'm still not over it, huh? Okay. Anyways, welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're setting Daf Ayin Vav, Daf 76 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, today's an exciting Daf. Who could tell me why today's an exciting Daf? Sheesh, I need more water already. Today is an exciting Daf because we are finishing Masechta Avodah Zarah. Can you imagine? Sheesh, Masechta Avodah Zarah was only 76 Daf. And yet, for 76 Daf is about 2.5 months, right? Yeah, 2.5 months, right? Yeah. And yet, I don't know, for me it felt like 4 months. What do you think? Do you agree with that? Was it just me, or was it... When we started Masechta Avodah Zarah, it was before that whole Iran thing, Rising Lion, or whatever that was called. Look, a lot has happened during Masechta Avodah Zarah. And yet, it's a relatively short Masechta, but it was a good one. We'll get back to it at the end of today's daf. But that's exciting because today we are finishing Masechta Avodah Zarah, which is pretty awesome. And today's daf, there are 4 sections. Section number 1, Kashering utensils. Basically, it's a continuation of a discussion that we began towards the end of yesterday's daf. And then Kashering skewers. Basically, we're gonna zoom in particularly on skewers, comparing skewers that we use for our own sort of personal use and comparing that to the skewers in the Beis Hamikdash and the differences in Kashering. That's a interesting. It's a discussion that gets interesting. Leeboon and haguleh, a little bit of the nitty gritty, how exactly it's done, let's say. And the Gemara ends, Masechta Avodah Zarah ends with the topic of sticking a knife into the ground and what role that has. So, pretty interesting final daf over here of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Let us jump in. Okay, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Beis, 3 lines in to the wide lines at the 2 dots. Tanu Rabbana, the rabbis taught, Halakeach Klei Tashmish Min Ha'ovdei Kechavim. Okay, somebody who purchases vessels from Min Ha'ovdei Kechavim, Devarim Shelo Nishtamish Boin. So if these are things that have never been used, brand new, Matbilan Ve'ein Torin. Okay, so just bring them to the mikveh. That's it. You don't need Leeboon or haguleh or anything. Just brand new vessel, never been used for nothing. Take it to the mikveh, and that is that. Things that were used, but only for cold stuff. Kigon kosis, v'gitonius, v'tzlochius, cups, pitchers, jugs. Madichon, wash them. Umadbila, make sure they're clean. Put them in the mikveh. Done. Don't need to do nothing else. Dvarim, that's it. Dvarim shenishtamesh bo in ayidei chamin, kigon ayoris v'akum kimusin mechami chamin. Things that were vessels that were used for heat, for example, pots and things, right? So things that you cook soups and things in it. So, megilon umadbilon veitorin. So you do haguleh. The Gemara is going to explain at the bottom of Daf Ayin Vav Amud Aleph that haguleh is betzim. You take the vessel and you put it in a bigger vessel, right? So if you can imagine, taking a big pot and taking these smaller vessels and putting them into this big pot of boiling water, and then the vessels will be kashered, and you can use them. And the Gemara in Ayin Vav Amud Aleph at the bottom is going to talk about what if this is the biggest pot you have and the other pots don't, right? What if this pot doesn't fit into other pots? What do you do? Seder. But anyways, things that are used for, in a hot way, so boil them, put them into boiling water, and that way you can kasher them that way. Or, and things that were used directly with fire, kigon, hashvuden va'askilos, for example, skewers and grills, right? Things that I guess there isn't really much. I mean, I guess the fire. It's interesting. Like technically, what's the difference between like a skewer and a pot? I mean, in both scenarios, the fire is kind of directly on the thing, but I guess the pot though, the contents of it are. It's not. I don't know. I can imagine like a skewer or a grill is just like the fire is just like it's like in the fire, whereas like a pot, you have the water and it's boiling. But yeah, it's interesting. What technically would be the difference between a skewer and a pot? It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, but pots, I guess, are more for cooking, whereas skewers are more like for roasting and things, I guess. Anyways, so or kigon ashvuden va'askelos, skewers and grills, milabnon. So you do Leeboon, and you use fire again with at the bottom of Ayin Vav Mud Aleph. We'll talk about what that process is like. Umatbilon ve'in torin, and then you put it in the mikvah, and it is tahor. And what if you didn't do all these steps? You didn't do if you had to do Leeboon, if you didn't do that, or haguleh, or bring it to the mikvah, then what happens? One opinion is osur, but the other opinion is mutter. Lo kasha, and it's no problem. They don't argue. Well, I can explain to you that they do argue, but I can explain to you the difference. Commander Omar knows in tam lefgam osur. Commander Omar knows in tam lefgam mutter. So according to the opinion, it says that if you don't, let's say, if you don't kasher these things, then whatever food you made in it is osur. It's because that opinion holds no sin tam lefgam is osur, meaning because let's say you buy a pot from Ovei Kochov, and that pot was used for pork, or whatever, but it was used for pork at least more than 24 hours ago, right? At least choose this can be interesting. Machlokas Rashi and Tosfos about is it 24 hours versus overnight or whatever, but let's assume that it was not used. Excuse me. If you are buying a pot from Ovei Kochov, so if we assume that it was used, let's just say more than 24 hours ago for the last time, so whatever flavor would be absorbed in the pot would be nosin tam lefgam. So if you say nosin tam lefgam is osur, well then whatever food you cook in the pot would be getting the pagam flavor, but nosin tam lefgam is osur, so then whatever you cook in there would be osur. But if like we saw the opinion of Reb Shimon and like Rava had paskin, like the nosin tam lefgam is mutter, so then technically speaking the food in the pot is mutter. Nosin tam lefgam mutter. Now, according to the Man Amr who says nosin tam lefgam is mutter, gi'ulei ovdei kochavim da'asur achmono heichi mishkachas law. This is similar to a discussion that we had maybe a week ago or something, that when the Torah talks about Vaymidyin, kol davar sheyovu b'esh taviu b'esh, that you have to kasher those vessels after the war, after the fight with Midian. So whatever vessels we took, they had to be kashered. How come they had to be kashered? Nosin tam lefgam is mutter. So answers Rav Chia Brei de Rav Huna that when the Torah says that you have to kasher those utensils, why? Nosin tam lefgam is mutter. Well, it's talking about ben yovel. It's talking about a vessel that was used that day for pork. In which case, it's not nosin tam lefgam, it's nosin tam lishvach. Although there's interesting choices about that. But anyways, well, it doesn't say it's nosin tam lishvach. Interesting. It says it's not nosin tam lefgam. Okay. And therefore, that is why you have to, that's why you'd have to kasher it. Because it was not a case of nosin tam lefgam. Fine. Mikan ve'elech lishtre. So fact the Gemara. Well, okay. If that's the case, then nosin tam lefgam is mutter. So then if it's ben yomo, you'd have to kasher. But if it's not ben yomo, you shouldn't have to kasher it. So gzera kedera she'eino bas yoma mishum kedera bas yoma. Yes, but even so, even if the vessel is it's been more than 24 hours, still we say you have to kasher it out of a concern for vessels that are that day. So we say just all vessels must be kashered and brought to the mikvah. The idach, according to the opinion who says nosen tam lefgam is aser, keder bas yoma nami mifgam pagma. In terms of explaining by midyon, kashering, when the Torah says you have to kasher pots, because even a vessel from that day, as we saw about a week ago or whatever, that yeshedulo pagma purta, that even if it's from that day, it wasn't used this second, it was used earlier, and it must have gotten a little bit worse, so it would still be considered nosen tam lefgam, and therefore the Torah is saying that even by nosen tam lefgam, you have to kasher the vessels. There's an interesting discussion between Rashi and Tosfos. And Rashi describes Ben Yoma Shabisha ba'ovik chov mayom, the top Rashi on the Amud, that he cooked in the vessel today. Aval bisha ba'esmol v'hifik ba'taimo belinas laila. You hear that? But if he cooked with it yesterday, so then overnight the flavor went away, got worse, got weakened. And therefore, since overnight whatever flavor was absorbed in the pot would have gotten worse, so by the time you use it again the next day, it's not doing any favors to the dish. Tosfos points out that assumes so according to Rashi, it's an overnight thing. It's not necessarily a 24-hour thing, right? So Rashi is defining Ben Yomo as that day, but comes the next day, even if it hasn't been 24 hours, it wouldn't be considered Ben Yomo anymore. It would already be considered nosen tam lefgam. Tosfos talks about maybe you should have to wait 24 hours. But anyways, okay. And now we get up to a discussion about kashering skewers, specifically differences between kashering skewers for our own personal use versus how they would be kashered in the Beis HaMikdash. Because of course in the Beis HaMikdash, I'm sure we're going to learn all about this in Masechta Zvachim, which is coming up soon. Of course, tomorrow we're starting Masechta Horius. Masechta Horius is an interesting one. Yeah, it's. Anyways, we'll get to Masechta Horius tomorrow. But anyways, some korbanis were by the Kohanim, in the Azara, in the Beis HaMikdash. And they were cooked there. And there were skewers there. So the way that you would kasher skewers in the Beis HaMikdash is a shtickle different than how you would kasher them in your own home. Okay. Says the Gemara, Rami Lei, Rav Amram le Rav Sheshes. Rav Amram asks Rav Sheshes, Tanan, we learn in our Mishnah, Shvuden va'askela, skewers, grills, milabnan ba'or, you kasher via Leeboon, you use fire. You kasher them directly with fire. V'atanan, we learn in the Mishnah, Gabi Kodshim, or by Korbanis, Hashvud ve'askela, skewers, grills, Magilon, bechamin. You boil them. You do agola. You kash them in hot water, not with direct fire. So in our Mishnah, we're saying that generally skewers and grills are kashered with direct application of fire, and yet in the Beis HaMikdash by Kodshim, they were kashered with boiling water. So Amalei, so Sheshes says to Amram Bri, Amram my son, my Inyud Kodshim Eitzel, Gula of the Kochavim, apples and oranges. Our Mishnah is talking about purchasing pots from Ovdei Kochavim. And Kodshim is talking about Kodshim, Korbanis. This is a little backwards, but also Misura Bala. You got to kind of mix around Hosam and Hocha. But anyways, the point is, when it comes to purchasing vessels from Ovdei Kochavim, so what was absorbed in the vessel was Isser, was pork or whatever. So you need Leeboon. That's the highest level of kashering, the most heat, direct fire. The Beis HaMikdash, it's the opposite. It's the holiest meat that there ever was. Korbanis. What's the concern, Agav, when it comes to Korbanis, as we're going to get to in a minute? No, sir. No, sir, right? There's a specific amount of time to eat Korbanis. For example, Korban Chatas, you have to eat that day. By the next day, it's noser. So whatever flavors from the previous day are absorbed in the pot, by the next day it's already noser, which is a chiyuv kares. So therefore, you're going to want to kasher the vessels. However, we're going to get into this in a second. However, says Rav Sheshes, big difference. In the Beis Hamikdash, we're talking about kashering from kodshim. By Avodah Zarah, we're talking about kashering from pork. So kashering pork requires fire. Kashering korbanos, boiling water is sufficient. I'm going to drink a stick of water. Givaldik. So let's read that again. So Amr says, Sheshes says to Rav Amram Bri, Amram, my son, my Indian kodshim etzel gula of the kechavim. Why are you comparing korbanos and kashering from of the kechavim? Hocha eteruk bala. By korbanos, what's absorbed in the skewers is mutter, is permitted as korbanos. Hasam isur bala. But when it comes to purchasing vessels from of the kechavim, they absorbed iser. So that needs fire. Omar Rave, but Rave asked a gavaldige kasha, and maybe you were wondering this as I was talking about noser a second ago. Sof. At the end of the day, we're talking about kashering. How come, as I mentioned a minute ago, how come we need to kasher vessels that were used for korbanos? Why should you have the kasher? They're used for korbanos, the holiest meat that there is. Sof kikapolit. Isur kapolit. The reason why you have to kasher korban skewers in this case used for korbanos is because if you use it for a korban chatas today, by tomorrow, meaning a korban chatas has to be eaten that day. You have to eat all the meat that day. Any meat that's left over is no, so you can't eat it. It's chiv kars if you eat it. Now, that applies also to whatever flavors were absorbed in the pot as well. If you use if you use the skewers for a korban chatas today, and now tomorrow you want to use it for a new korban chatas, but what about the flavor from yesterday's korban chatas that's going to go into today's korban chatas that's being cooked? That flavor is aser. It's noser. It's a chiyuv kares. So Rava says to Rav Sheshes, I get that maybe it started out mutter, it started out as the holiest meat that there is, as kodshim, but by the next day, it's a chiyuv kares. So Rava says to Rav Sheshes, okay, great, it may have started out as kodshim, but at the end of the day, you're kashering it because it's noser now. It's not kosher anymore. It's not mutter anymore. So again, so there's actually a different gears that says Rabbah. I'm going to read Rabbah because we're going to see a different shita from Rabbah in a few minutes. So I'm going to read this as Rabbah. So again, Omar Rabbah says Rabbah, sof, at the end of the day, hikapalit, what you are expelling from the skewers, isur kapalit, is iser, is noser. That's serious stuff. May have started out as mutter, but by now it's very, very aser. Elo Omar Rabbah, rather says Rabbah, my haguleh, Nami, you know what? When the Mishnah by Kodshim is talking about haguleh, it doesn't actually mean haguleh. Shtifa Mrika means to rinse it out. That's it. It's talking about rinsing the skewers. It's a little confusing. I'm going to assume that we're still talking about skewers, but I feel like a lot of the descriptions that we're referring to now seem to be referring more to pots and things, but I mean, we are talking about skewers, and we are talking about haguleh by skewers. So I guess that's misunderstanding, but it sounds to me like we're talking about taking the skewers or the grills and putting them in boiling water. But I'm going to assume that we're talking about skewers. So anyways, so it says Rabbah that we're talking about, even when it says haguleh, usually haguleh is in boiling water. No, says Rabbah, we're not talking about actually boiling these skewers. My haguleh nami shtifa umrika. I just read that again. It's talking about rinsing them off, washing them. Talking about washing them, that's it. But you would still have to do Leeboon, that's the point. Kilu, when we're saying haguleh over here, we're not talking about kashering. We're talking about just rinsing, making sure that they're clean, rinsing them off. But you would still, to kasher them, you would have to do Leeboon, just like for pork. Amle Abaye says to Rabbah, midami, Riko shtifa b'tzolin haguleh b'chamin. Abaye says, 1 second. That's weird that the Mishnah would say haguleh as a reference to shtifo marika. Shtifa Marika is with cold water, rinsing off with cold water. Haguleh is a specific thing, purging with boiling water. Abai says it's very weird that the Mishnah would use the word haguleh if it was really referring to Shtifa Marika. Those are very different types of applications of water. And I just did a third application of water. I drink water. Elom Rabbi, rather says Abai, Yagid Olav Reo. Its friend will speak about it. We are referring to the Mishnah here in Avodah Zarah, and the Mishnah in wherever that other Mishnah is. Where's that other Mishnah? In Zvachim. They are friends. You hear that? Mishnayos could be friends. That's nice. So the Mishnah here in Avodah Zarah and the Mishnah in Zvachim are friends. And they are informing, right? We could apply them. Tzazamen. Could apply this to that and that to this. Tanahacha Leeboon. Our Mishnah here in Avodah Zarah talks about Leeboon. When it comes to skewers and grills, you have to kash them with fire. But guess what? It's not just Leeboon, you would also have to boil it. You'd boil it and do Leeboon. Tanohasum haguleh. And in Zvachim it talks about haguleh, but guess what? It's not just haguleh. Vodin Leeboon. You'd also have to do Leeboon. So it says Abaye actually. So our Mishnah here in Avodah Zarah talks about Leeboon. The Mishnah in Zvachim talks about haguleh. And the point is that you have to do both in both scenarios. When you purchase a vessel from an Ovik Chovim, you have to do haguleh and Leeboon. And the same, by Kachim, you do haguleh and Leeboon. Gonna drink a little bit more water. Amar Ravid, Amalei Ravid says Tabai Yihachi. So Ravid says something interesting. What Ravid says is meh. That's what he says. It says meh. It says meh. That wouldn't be the normal way to apply something to something else. Meaning, Ravid says, look, if let's say by Avodah Zarah, here in our Mishnah in Avodah Zarah, purchasing vessels from an Ovik Chovim, it said, let's say, haguleh and Leeboon. And then, by Kachim, it said only haguleh. So we would say, okay, it says haguleh in both places. And just like in Avodah Zarah, it's haguleh and Leeboon. So also by Kachim, it's haguleh and Leeboon. Okay, Rava argues that if it wanted to apply one thing to the other and say that they have the same halachis, so it would have both halachis in one place and only one in the other place, and we would kind of like say, well, just like it's both in that place, it's also both in this place. Says Rava, it's weird to say that in our Mishnah Avodah Zarah it talks about Leeboon, and in the Mishnah in Zvachim it talks about haguleh, or let's say it the other way around. It's more likely, says Rava, that if the Mishnah in Avodah Zarah is talking about Leeboon, and the Mishnah in Zvachim is talking about haguleh, it's literal. By purchasing from an Ovik Chovim, it's Leeboon, and by Kachim, it's haguleh. We're not just going to say, well, it says this halacha there and that halacha there, let's just wrap them all up together. No. The halacha that it says in Masechta Avodah Zarah is for Avodah Zarah. The halacha it says in Zvachim is for Kachim. So, Amalei says to Abaye, Yochi, if it's like you're saying, Abaye, that it's Leeboon and haguleh, both by purchasing from an Ovik Chovim as well as by Kachim, one of the scenarios should have everything. So let's say here in the Mishnah of Avodah Zarah it should have haguleh and Leeboon. And then by Kachim, let's say, it should have just haguleh. And then we'll say, okay, let's apply one to the other and say, okay, well, even though by Kachim it only says haguleh, but it says haguleh by the Mishnah Avodah Zarah as well. Just by the Mishnah Avodah Zarah, when purchasing from Ovik Chovim, it's haguleh and Leeboon. So also by Kachim, it's haguleh and Leeboon. That would be the way to do it, but not to have only Leeboon here and haguleh there and say that everything goes together. It says Rava, no. If it says Leeboon here, it's only Leeboon. It says haguleh there, it's only haguleh. That's at Elo. Omar Rove rather says Rove. Kod Jemainu Taimayu This is the reason why haguleh is sufficient by Kashering. Why you don't have to do Leeboon by Kashering. You ready? It's an interesting answer. It's an interesting answer. The reason why you don't have to do Leeboon by Kashering, why haguleh is enough, is because this is why by Kashering all you have to do is haguleh is Rav Nachman and Rav Barvua. Like Rav Nachman and Rav Barvua. The Amar who says, Kol yem voyem naise giul lachavero. Do you hear that? Every day is an expulsion for his friend. What does that mean? Well, for example, friends, let's say you have a korban shlomin. We're going to learn Perek Ezu Mekoman in Masechta Zvachim. We'll be learning Perek Ezu Mekoman in, I don't know, a few months. Maybe 6 months, let's say, I don't know. Maybe less? Probably less. Who says Ezu Mekoman in the morning? You say Ezu Mekoman, Korbanos? Who's been saying Ezu Mekoman their entire life? Or for many years, but never actually learned Ezu Mekoman? We're going to learn the Perek of Ezu Mekoman within the next few months. In Perek Ezu Mekoman, it talks about that, right, it says, by Shlomim Kodshim Kalim, Shchitosan, B'chom HaKavah Zarah, V'damaton, Shemon Hashem, V'nechol, B'chol Adam, the Shnei Yomim V'layla Echad. For 2 days and the night between. And therefore, so Korban Shlomim, you can eat for 2 days. So if a Korban Shlomim is offered today, or maybe let me actually say yesterday. If we have yesterday, today, and tomorrow, let's do that. Hopefully I won't confuse myself. If a Korban Shlomim was offered yesterday, so you can eat it yesterday, and today it's still kosher. Okay? And therefore, says Rava, when you offer a korban shlom yesterday and you cook it on the skewers, well then, when you cook a korban shlomim again today, and you put today's korban shlomim on the skewers, well, it's purging yesterday's flavors into today's shlomim, and that's okay because shlomim is still kosher. It's a 2-day korban, so it was offered yesterday, and now when you're offering today's korban shlomim, any flavors from yesterday, which are still kosher, it's not yet noser, is now being purged from the skewers from yesterday's shlomim, and the flavors are going into today's shlomim, all good, but yesterday's shlomim flavors are now gone, and they're in today's shlomim. And then when we have tomorrow's korban shlomim, today's flavors are going to be expelled into that, but it's always going to be okay. The Gemara is going to ask later on, then why do you need haguleh b'chlal? It sounds like if we just keep on purging things, then all good. Why do we even need to kasher anything? Nothing's ever becoming noser. But anyways, so it says Rava, it's an interesting answer, right? So Amar le Rava, so Rava says to Abaye, so Elo Amar Rava, so rather says Rava, Kodshim anu taimayu, this is prat by Kodshim, Kedav Nachman Am Rav Barvod, Amar, Kol yom bayom nasa giul lachaver. Each day is a purge for its friend, I guess for yesterday. And it prevents it ever becoming noser. Teinach shlomim, okay, this is all fine and good when it comes to shlom. Because shlomim is a 2-day korban. So yesterday's shlom will get purged into today. And then today's will get purged into tomorrow, all good. It's always kosher. It's a 2-day korban. You never becomes noser. But right, they came to the Shnei Yom Misachli, because since a korban shlomim is eaten for 2 days, become it and have a noser. So before it becomes noser on day 3, ka have a giul, its flavors have already been expelled into another day's shlom. Elachatas, but when it comes to a korban chatas, since a korban chatas is only able to be eaten for that day and the following night, well, when you cook a korban chatas on these skewers today, have a noser, it's going to be noser. Well, then tomorrow, when you use these skewers either for a shlom or for a chatas, it doesn't matter. But if today you are going to be using these skewers for korban chatas, well then by tomorrow, any flavors that were absorbed in the skewers from today's chatas, by tomorrow, those flavors are going to be noser. And then tomorrow, when you cook anything, whether a shlamim, chatas, it makes no difference. Kapolit noser the chatas do'idna, today's chatas, which by tomorrow is going to be noser, is going to be, its flavors are going to be expelled and infused bechatas v'shlam de l'macher, in tomorrow's chatas or shlamim, and that is a problem. Amri lo tzricha, so they say, the chimavashal b'chatas ha'idna, because what they do is that if today they're using the skewers for korban chatas, so what they do is they're aware, right? They have us all figured out. They're aware that, right, of course, korban chatas can only be eaten today, and by tomorrow it's going to be noser. So if any skewers that were used for korban chatas, they make sure, they'll make sure that to then use those same skewers today for korban shlamim, in order to make sure that, okay, already today, so if you cook a korban chatas today, they'll make sure to cook a shlamim also today, so that the flavors from the previous use, from the chatas, are being infused into the shlamim. And then when you use the skewers the next day, for whatever korban you want, it's the flavors from yesterday's shlamim that are going to be infused, and it's going to be okay. The chatas de l'macha v'shlamim de esmol b'adei adodei koshlim zimnayu. Since tomorrow's chatas and yesterday's shlamim are going to finish at the same time, and then you'll cook tomorrow's shlamim shish. Well, the yesterday's and today's are a little bit confused, but it's really not that hard. Okay, let's go over the yesterdays and the today's. Everything got a little bit confusing, but it's really not that hard, right? The point is, so Rav is saying, look, here's the thing. When it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, they basically have it worked out so that they're always going to essentially be avoiding noser, right? They're always going to be making sure that, each time the skewers are used, so the previous use, the flavors in the previous use are being expelled in the current use. So therefore, if the concern is about noser, well, if you're cooking a korban shlamim, so then yesterday's korban shlamim is still kosher today. So when you cook any korban today, whether chat or shlamim, doesn't matter. So the flavors from yesterday's shlamim were going to be infused in today's korban, but that's fine because yesterday's shlamim is still kosher today. And when you cook a korban, so let's say we cooked the korban chatas yesterday, well then by today it would be noser, but what they would do is that after cooking the korban chatas yesterday, they would then cook a korban, they would use the skewers for korban shlamim. So the flavors in the chatas would be infused into the shlamim, and then by today, yesterday's shlamim is still kosher, and it'll be the flavors from yesterday's shlamim that are being infused into whatever meat is being cooked today. So basically, they would always work it out so that there was never noser, and that there was always mutter flavors, kosher flavors that were being infused into whatever meat was being cooked. So, fact the Gemara, if that's the case, haguleh nami lo libai. Well, if that's the case, then why do we even require haguleh? If they're always on it, they're always on the ball, always making sure that nothing's ever going to become noser, well, then why do you even need to do haguleh? The Gemara says kasher. It's a good question. Why do you need to do haguleh if they're always making sure nothing becomes noser? Good question. Okay. Rav Papa Omer says, Rav Papa, hi korid, hi lo korid. Oh, so Rav Papa offers an answer to say that the difference is that, well, by the pot, well, let's say this. In the Beis HaMikdash, well, not pots, but in the Beis HaMikdash, skewers, grills, these things are being used all the time, right? There's korbanos in the Beis HaMikdash day in, day out. There's a lot of turnover on these skewers and things. Therefore, it doesn't, to kasher it, doesn't need Leeboon, doesn't need the highest intensity of kashering, because flavors and things aren't really hardening on these skewers, as opposed to, I don't really use grills. I don't use much, really. But anyways, forget about me. I guess your average grill, it's like almost like imagine like a restaurant grill versus your grill at home. a restaurant grill day in, day out is being used. Things aren't really sitting there. Whereas your average Oved Kochavim, skewers, grills, things are sitting and hardening, and therefore if you want a kasher, you really have to do a yisodi. You have to do a very thorough cleansing with fire. But in the Beis HaMikdash, boiling was enough. Again, for Papa or Mrs. Papa, I carried, when it comes to the skewers and the grills of Oved Kochavim, the things will harden on there, therefore you have to use fire. High low card, but in the Beis HaMikdash, since there's a lot of turnover, things are being cooked all the time, things aren't really hardening, and therefore haguleh is sufficient. Rav Ashi, Mrs. Rav Ashi, La'olam Kedamar Meirikar. Oh, so Rav Ashi Taka says that it's like we initially said. The initial, Rav Shesh's initial distinction, which is, when it comes to Oved Kochavim, we're talking about pork. When it comes to the Beis HaMikdash, we're talking about korbanos. You said, yeah, but I don't care that we're talking about korbanos. At the end of the day, what the concern is that that there's flavors of nosa. That's a big deal. Yeah, but still, yeah, but at the time that it is expelling the noser, there isn't the isser, but there is no isser. Meaning, when it comes to pork or something, okay, so if we're talking about skewers that had pork on them, so there was literally pork on the isser interacted directly with the skewer, right? There was like literally pork on this skewer. Whereas when it comes to noser, it's more conceptual, right? You had a korban, right? You had a korban chatas, and you used the skewer to cook the korban chatas. Korban chatas obviously is kosher. It's the holiest meat that there is. Korbanos meat. But then there's some kind of a switch that, all of a sudden, the clock strikes 12. All of a sudden, the flavors that until now were amazing turn to noser. It's a conceptual switch. So because there's no actual physical isser, it's just a conceptual switch into isser. So therefore, it's enough. Haguleh is sufficient, as opposed to the skewers of an Oved Kochavim, where it was like literally interacting directly with like pork. So then you would have to do Leeboon. And now we get a little bit into the nitty gritty of Leeboon and haguleh. Vadkama milabnon. Tell me more about the fire, right? To what extent? You take the fire and you fire up the skewers or whatever. Until, it sounds like until kind of some outer layer. What does that even mean, really? Until some outer layer comes off or something? What does that even mean? I don't know exactly. Maybe it's till it's like red hot and like there's like an outer layer. Like, what does it mean the outer layer like falls off? I don't know. Maybe it gets like soft or something like that. I don't know. Achetasher klipasan. Till their shells come off. Maybe like any stuff that was like on the outside of it kind of like falls off. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I have to kind of look into that more, I guess. What exactly does that mean? But I guess it means pretty hot. And how do you do haguleh? Boiling. You take, if you have a smaller pot, put it in a bigger pot. Okay, what about if it's the biggest pot? Then what do? You can't put it into a bigger pot. So Tashma, there was a vat, I guess a big vessel by Rav Akavya. Ahader lei gadafno delisha apuma. What he did was he took some dough and he wrapped around the lip of the pot from the outside. Umalyua maya, and then filled up the pot with water. And got it boiling. And that's what he did. Let's go by there for a second. Rava says, Rava, man chokim lemembud ki ha milsa ilav Rav Akavya. Who would have been so smart as to have come up with this solution, if not Rav Akavya, the Gabarabu? He's such a great man. Kasaver kibolo kachpoto, because he figures kibolo, as it's absorbed, that's how it expels. Mabolo ben nitzotzes, apolto ben nitzotzes, just like it was absorbed with sparks. Also, it's expelled with sparks. I think the point is, because what's the solution? I guess, look, if you have a smaller vessel and you could put it in a larger vessel, whether it's a pot or whether it's, I don't know, a fork or something, right? So you take a fork and just submerge it in boiling hot water. So the whole thing's in the boiling hot water, easy. But what about if you're talking about a pot and the pot's not going to fit into other pots. How do you kasher a pot? So the thing is, like, if you fill up the pot halfway and boil it so the water can get all boiling and stuff, but you're only going to be kashering half the pot, how do you literally kasher the whole pot? Because you fill it all the way to the top. I don't know, I guess it would be hard to like boil that way if it was like filled all the way to the top, or if it's still like, I guess it has to be able to contain the water. Basically, the question is, how do you also like kasher like the lips or something? So he came up with this scheme where you take some dough and wrap it around it, and that way I guess it could handle, I guess, being able to boil it all the way, like fill it all the way up to the, like as high as it can go and still be able to boil it or something. Now, I think it was maybe a note in the article, because I think what I understand, maybe this is what other people do as well for kashering pots, is like, what you could do is you could fill up a pot with water, like, you know, as high as you reasonably can. And then you like put something into the pot that will like make it overflow. And like that, the water will kind of like overflow the top of the pot and like get the top of it as well. I think that's the same concept. Basically, that I think it's trying to solve the same problem, which is like, how do you kind of get the water as high up as it can go and also like get the lip? So, and Rav is saying like, well, anyways, like the lip, when you're cooking, you're not going to fill it all the way up to the top. So any, let's say pork or whatever that would have interacted with the lip would have been sparks, like splatterings or whatever. So therefore, it just needs to get up, I guess, high enough that like the water from the boiling can kind of be, I guess it doesn't have to be like super immersed there, but at least just get there on some basic level, which I guess, yeah, if you take like something and like display, you know, dump it into the pot to displace some water and then it just overflows over the water briefly, over the sides briefly, that should be enough. And I guess that's probably a similar concept, I don't know, by wrapping it around so it just enables you to fill it up better. Interesting solution. And now to wrap up, Daf Ayin Vav Masechta Avodah Zarah and Masechta Avodah Zarah itself. Hasakin shofa v'torah, a knife, scrape it on some kind of a stone or something, and then it's tahora. Amar Rav Ukve bar Chame v'noyatzo asar pa'amim v'karka, and stab it into the ground 10 times. Amar Rav Huna breder Rav Yeshua v'karka she'ena avuda, and it has to be ground that hasn't been like worked, right? Because if it's worked, then it's soft. The whole point, I guess, it's going to be like doing a deep cleanse kind of thing, you know, in a rough ground. Rav Kahana uvesakin yofet shem bagumis. It says of Kahana, a good knife that doesn't have any holes in it where Isser can like accumulate. Tana Amiyachi, also in a price like this, sakin yofet shem bagumis. When you have a good knife that has no holes in it, no atza asar paimim b'karka, you could jab it 10 times into the ground. Rav Huna breder Yeshua. It says of Yuna B'Dev Yeshua that this, however, is only going to be good for cold stuff, right? Because it's not going to get rid of any like Isser in it. If you use it for like cooking steak on a barbecue or something, well, then you have to worry about any Isser that was absorbed in the knife getting into the steak, right? So this jabbing into the ground does like a basic clean, so you can use it for like vegetables, you know, cold stuff. Like Mar Yehuda and Bati Bar Tuvi. They were sitting before Shvor Malka. Also, Aisu Kamayu Esroge, and came before them. So it was Shvor Malka and Mar Yehuda and Bati Bar Tuvi, and they brought out an esrig. Posak and Shvor Malka cut off a piece, Ocha, and he enjoyed it. Posak va'avle Bati Bar Tuvi cut off another piece, gave it to Bati Bar Tuvi. Hadar Dotsa Asar Zinne, and then he jabbed it into the ground 10 times. Be'ara, into the ground, Posak, and then cut a third piece, Havle Mar Yehuda, and distributed that piece to Mar Yehuda. Amle Bati Bar Tuvi. Bati Bar Tuvi, he got offended. And he says to Shvor Malka, V'au Gaver Labar Yisraelu, what are you saying? I'm not a Yid? That you didn't jab it into the ground 10 times for me? Omelei. So Shvor Malka says, look, Mar Kimli Begave, Mar Lo Kimli Begave. Look, I know about Mar Yehuda that he is makpid about these kinds of things. Right? Rashi says, Rav Yehuda Makir Anibo Shu Parush V'Liyocha Dvar Isser. Avabucha Any Muvzat Shetei Parush Kokach. Shvor Malka says, look, I know that Rav Yehuda, I guess Mar Yehuda is Rav Yehuda, I guess I know about Rabbi Yehuda that he's going to be mocked, but I want to make sure that I'm doing what I can before I give it to him. But I didn't know that you would have been so mocked. Those would say, Omle Shvarmaka says to him, Idkur mai avdas borta. Well, I know what you did last night. Apparently, so he was the king of Persia. Apparently, the Persians, it was part of their hospitability that they would provide women at night. So when they provided a woman for Bati Bartuvi, he accepted. When they provided for Rav Yehuda, he declined. He was probably learning. So therefore, Shvarmaka says, well, just based on that basic test, I was figured I should be more makpid when it comes to Rav Yehuda. Hadron olach hasoicher sapoyo uslika lo mesechta avodah zarah shish. That was daf ayin vav of Mesechta Avodah Zarah, the final daf of Mesechta Avodah Zarah. We talked about kashering utensils. Was a little bit of like a review from yesterday almost, that if it's cold utensils, just put it in the mikvah. Hot utensils, haguleh plus mikvah. But if it was used with fire, like skewers or grills, then you have to do Leeboon and put it and dip it in the mikvah. Kashering skewers, usually it requires Leeboon. But in the Beis HaMikdash for Kodshim, it requires just haguleh, and we discussed that in depth of why that is so. We saw the very interesting opinion of Rava talking about how each day would expel the flavors from the day before, and they would make sure that there were always kosher flavors, but ultimately that didn't necessarily explain why it required haguleh, because we said, well, it never becomes no, so why do you need haguleh b'chlal? But we saw one opinion is that in the Beis HaMikdash, because of all the turnover, basically haguleh would have been enough, because there was always turnover. Things weren't like getting hard, as opposed to by an ovek chavim, things are going to harden over time because it's not used as much. And we also saw the opinion that in the Beis HaMikdash, it wasn't interacting directly with the Isser, it just kind of becomes noser overnight, more conceptually, and therefore haguleh is sufficient. We talked about how exactly to do Leeboon and haguleh. Leeboon is in the fire until the outer layer peels off. Okay. Haguleh is, you could put a small pot in a big pot, so basically boil up water and dip things in that water. For really big pots, put a dough lip around the top so you can fill it up high. Okay. And then we talked about sticking a knife into the ground 10 times after scraping it, which is effective after scraping for cold foods. Well, Cheva, that was Masechta Avodah Zarah. No. What do you think? That was some Masechta. I think, as I said earlier, it was only 76 daf, which is like 2.5 months. But for me, it feels like it was like 4 months or even 6 months. It feels like, not 6, but it feels like it was much longer. A lot of stuff happened. Masechta Avodah Zarah. A lot of stuff. What country was I even in when I think I started Masechta Avodah Zarah in this country, but then as I was in America, I got stuck there for a month doing the whole Iran thing. We came back here. But it was a good Masechta, right? The first part, there was all that, like that, very interesting Agaritas, right? We had Reb Meir, Aloha de Meir Aneni. We had the stories with Chanina ben Trajim. We saw at the beginning, there were all those things about Yesh Kon Olam B'Shah Achas. That was like a theme that came up a few times. Rebbe, Antoninus. There were lots of really interesting stuff at the beginning. Also like giving of the Torah and all the other nations and that kind of stuff. We talked about different festivals of Avodah Zarah, and then we started getting into Avodah Zarah more. And then, of course, we got into, Bishul Akum, Pas Akum, Gvinas Akum, Shemen Akum, those interesting sugyas. And then, of course, Yein Nesech, Stam Yeinam, which was a huge part of Masechta Avodah Zarah. So, and then we got into Isser Beheter at the end. We covered a lot of ground in Masechta Avodah Zarah. Sheesh. Upon reflection, Masechta Avodah Zarah is a mighty da, a mighty Masechta. So, Cheved, tomorrow I'll see you for Masechta Horius. We're just on Masechta Horius. That's an interesting Masechta. I'm already on Daf. I'm up to Daf Vav already. Masechta Horius, which is about halfway through the whole Masechta. The whole thing is 14 Daf. It's interesting. We'll talk more about it tomorrow. So, Cheved, have a great day. Mazel Tov. Give yourselves a pat on the back. I'll catch you tomorrow for Masechta Horius.